Attorney General Merrick Garland has ordered federal prosecutors to terminate the inequality of charging and sentencing between powder cocaine and crack cocaine. The new policy will seek to eliminate the significant difference in the amount of powder cocaine relative to crack cocaine required to trigger mandatory minimum federal sentences. Federal law, as outlined by the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, set a 5-year sentence minimum for the possession of just 5 grams of crack compared to 500 grams of powder cocaine. That's a 100-to-1 difference. The Fair Sentencing Act of 2010 reduced that ratio to 18-to-1, where it remains today.
Senator Chuck Grassley hit out against the Biden administration's move because it could potentially disrupt legislation set to address the sentencing disparity currently drafted in Congress. Grassley said, quote, "A bipartisan group of lawmakers, including myself, just recently came to an agreement on statutory changes that could possibly be included in the year-end funding bill. That hard-won compromise has been jeopardized because the Attorney General inappropriately took lawmaking into his own hands."
So what do you make of this, Ameshia? Who's right?
Long time coming. I don't know what's wrong with Chuck Grassley. Anytime you have a 100-to-1 difference in sentencing, and let's be real here, the fact that there is a crack and powder cocaine disparity is largely because of who's the face of the users of one versus the other. When we talk about crack and we talk about the elongated and quite frankly ridiculous sentencing structure that has been given to them, it's largely because the users happen to be black and brown people. White people in white communities, while they were doing coke, while they were selling coke, while all of this happened, and mind you, they have the same scientific makeup in terms of those drugs. They never saw the level of sentencing, the level of policing, any of what we saw in black communities, specifically in the 80s, which we saw essentially create the rise of the United States prison industrial complex. It was largely driven by legislation like this that was enacted and disproportionately affected black communities. I think that this change was a long time coming, and that, quite frankly, it's one of the things that I will applaud this DOJ for. And I don't have a lot of things that I'm thankful for Merrick Garland for at this point, but this is one that I think is extremely important and proof positive that we can create a system that is more equitable, because quite frankly, this wasn't at its inception.
Yeah, my thinking on this has evolved since reading James Foreman's Locking Up Our Own, which is a really deep dive into how this came about and why there were so many leaders within the Black community asking for the crime bill that ended up, we know now, being so disastrous. I think the argument then was that the impact that crack was having on poor Black communities was so disastrous and so devastating. I mean, the impact on the whole community, because of course drugs bring all of the other crimes with them, right? That there needed to be something to address specifically the impact of that drug in those communities. Now, I totally agree with you that the way they went about this was just so blatantly racist that it really undermined whatever, good intentions there may have been in the beginning, and that the answer should have been, much more investment in those communities to help them in a way that they felt respected them and they felt honored them and gave them dignity in fighting for the kinds of change that so desperately needed. But I can't help but feel that, I used to also feel, this was, implemented for racist reasons. We must get rid of it for, if we want to pursue, racial justice. But I do think that it's a mistake to say that we should be totally race neutral in trying to deal with these problems, because they impact different communities in different ways. And so obviously a disparity between crack and cocaine is in effect ends up being racist. And that's really problematic. I agree with you. It's good that we're getting rid of that. But to say that we've solved the problem when those communities are still struggling with the same disinvestment, the same rise in crime in a way that other communities, aren't, I think to go in the other direction, say we've solved the problem, would be a mistake as well. What do you make of that argument?
I think I agree with it on its face. And my argument isn't that this is going to alleviate all ills within minority communities. I don't think that that's true at all. Also, the usage of crack today is very different than it was in the 80s and early 90s. But with that being said, I do think it's important. It's an important step forward to those who have been fighting against this legislation for quite some time and acknowledging the differences that there are amongst communities, but also particularly engaging in and seeing how far America has come in their idea of how to manage addiction. We look at how crack cocaine was treated in the late 80s, in the early 90s, and how these people were demonized, how their communities were demonized, how crack babies were run and showcased all over television, how Ronald Reagan made very distinct comments attacking black mothers specifically in these communities who were watching people die with needles in their arms, and how frustrating it was. And to your point, why there was such rallying cry from civil rights leaders, from those organizations, from black churches to try to do something, and the reasons why they approved of and asked for things like the crime bill, which turned out to be vicious and hellified later on. A lot of that was because of the disparities and the, quite frankly, maddening things and destructive things that they saw in their communities. But I think that we have to go further than that, because we're watching empathy in motion when we talk about the opioid crisis. We're watching healthcare and healthcare resources be given to people who we now recognize cannot control their addictions. We saw none of that empathy in the 80s and 90s. And I particularly think of this because of the face of who was most largely affected. When we talk about opioid crises, there aren't a ton of people who look like me on the screen. When we talk about crack, the first people folks think of is African Americans. And I think that when we saw that, and we saw how legislators treated it, and we saw how the media treated it, there is not a greater argument that can be made than race did play a sizable role. And for individuals who are currently still locked up, because many of them are, even though Merrick Garland's push in this sense could change things, does it change things for the guys who spent the past 30 or 40 years in prison? Absolutely not, because from what I'm seeing, this is not retroactive. So what does it do for the communities who have lost their parents, who have lost the leader of their household, the leader of their community for decades, based on something that is now seen as one of the largest disparities in criminal justice that this nation has ever seen?
Yeah, and I think, it can both be the case that people who commit crimes that, are devastating to their entire community, that for some of those people, incarceration is the right answer. But what are we doing as a society to make up for what you just so well put, the absence of fathers, the absence of men in those communities? Like, okay, fine. Let's say you say, like, the only way to deal with this is to lock people up. We could have a debate about that. But let's say you're on the side, let's say you're a conservative and you think that was the right thing to do. But what did you do to then protect the children that were left behind from living in communities where they didn't have fathers? That's supposed to be a conservative concern, right? The family unit, children born to parents who are married, right? The number one predictor for upward mobility. What did the right do to say, okay, we think this man is bad, and the only answer is to put him in prison for 30 years for what he did. We're gonna make sure that those children don't then suffer from growing up in a community where there are no men, where this lawlessness that comes from the fact that there are no male role models. So I think that there's sort of the problem is kind of on both sides. On the left, there's sort of this inability to talk about crime, this inability to respect and honor the victims of crime. But on the right, there was a sort of refusal to acknowledge the impact of the law and order proposals. And what we really need is something sort of somewhere in the middle that, where you say, okay, if you commit a crime, there are going to be consequences. But the number one thing these communities need are good jobs, access to good jobs, good job training. Nobody with a good job is going to be out there selling crack, right? So I think that it's one of those problems where both sides has really dropped the ball.
No, I 100% agree with you there. Again, it's the same argument we can have for violence and violence-stricken communities that don't experience it episodically, but see it on a day-to-day basis. In large part, the economic institutions around those communities are crumbling or they have totally eroded. Same thing with education systems. This goes back to the foundational things for society to move forward, in particularly communities that have been downtrodden for years and disinvested in for years. You have to go back to the very beginning. You have to ensure that they feel safe. You have to ensure that they have housing that is supportive of their families. You have to make sure that they have an education system that allows for them to have the training and the skills for the jobs of now and the jobs of the future. And those jobs of now and jobs in the future also have to be in their communities. It becomes a very cyclical experience when it takes you, 3 buses and a train to get to a job. And that job only pays you minimum wage. So I think that we have to understand in context what these communities are facing. And they weren't just facing it at the inception of this ridiculous legislation in the 80s. They're still facing these same problems every day today.
100%. 100%. Well, we will have more Rising right after this.